Welcome to a brand new episode of Seize the Moment podcast. And today we have a very special guest. We have Cass Sunstein. He's the Robert Walmsley University Professor at Harvard Law School. From 2009 to 2012, he was administrator of the White House Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. And since that time, he has served in the U.S. government in several different roles. Advisor to many nations and international organizations, he is the author of Nudge with Richard H. Thaler, Noise with Daniel Kahneman and Olivier Sibony, The World According to Star Wars, and Wiser with Reid Hastie. And today we'll be discussing his book, How to Become Famous, Lost Einsteins, Forgotten Superstars, and How the Beatles Came to Be. Cass, it's a pleasure to have you on, and thank you so much for being here today.
All thanks to you. Of my various scribblings, this is my favorite, so I'm really delighted you chose to talk about it.
Absolutely. And so I just want to kind of note this before we start. So Cass, my college mentor, Dr. Tim Stroop, who unfortunately now has passed away. So he was actually a huge admirer of yours. He used to give us your books back when we were in school and even after the fact. So if he were still alive to see this, I promise you he would have flipped. He would have been so happy and so excited for it.
That's very kind.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so to begin with a passage from Cass's book, he wrote, in the domain of innovation in general, social scientists, sounding a lot like Jane Franklin, refer to lost Einsteins, those who would have had highly impactful inventions had been exposed to innovation in childhood. The emphasis here is on demographic characteristics such as race, gender, and socioeconomic status, and on the contribution of role models and network effects to success. Countless potential innovators in science, business, and elsewhere were born in a family that did not or could not help, did not find the right role models, were subjugated in some way, or did not benefit from networks. As a result, they never innovated. They lost life's lottery or a series of smaller lotteries. If young Cassius Clay had not had his bicycle stolen, would he have become the most famous person in the world? Might there have been other athletes even greater than Muhammad Ali who never made it into the public stage? Ali is my personal favorite, and it pains me to say so, but of course the answer is yes. So, Cass, can we first get into this idea of how to become famous? So, in your book, the title is a misnomer, as I tell people when I talk to them about it. So, in your book, it's not so much of a manual on how one should become famous or one could become famous. It's a little bit broader and a little bit deeper. So, can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so the title's a little bit of an inside joke because the theme of the book is there isn't a manual. Though if you get the book and you want to be famous, it's pretty much guaranteed or your money back, whether you're a movie star or a rock star or a famous novelist. Read the book and it'll completely work for you. Bracketing that, I guess the right word is falsehood. The book is about the serendipitous nature of fame and the fact that whether we're speaking of the Beatles or Taylor Swift or Stan Lee, the guy behind the Marvel Comics, or Jane Austen, the woman behind various, things have to happen to get them to where they got. And those things that had to happen that are necessary aren't about their own amazingness, though all of them are amazing. So it's almost right to say to become famous, you have to be, at least in some respect, amazing. It's not quite right, but it's almost right. But if you are amazing, that is, you're supremely talented with respect to the piano, or you're just incredible with law, you might not get anywhere unless 10 or 50 or 150 things break right for you.
Well,
I'm curious, do you think there's actually, I mean, having read your book, I think the answer is no to this, but do you think there's a way to sort of engineer serendipity? If, for example, let's say you know that on one level it can be social connections that may lead to fame. Another one is, yes, that stupendous level of talent. It can be charisma. It can be transcending or being daring, let's say like a Houdini. Do you think if somebody, let's say, was aware of all of these different factors, there was a way, especially with the advent of like things like TikTok and YouTube and all of that, that they could sort of engineer that serendipity, or even then it's still more about luck.
It's a great question. So I'm thinking that there are lots of daring people out there, like countless daring people who are a certain number of them are fantastically talented. So they're both daring and they're really good at things, and we've never heard of them. Are
Hmm.
they less amazing at things than Houdini? Maybe, but maybe not. Houdini appears in the book, and there are a few things that happened to make him Houdini, and they could have gone the other way. So, on engineering, you can increase probabilities. So, I'm right now about to publish a book on another topic, and my editor slash supporter is very savvy at these things. And I've seen editors, people at presses who are good at this.
Mm.
And there are about 10 things you do to increase the likelihood that your book becomes, well known and read by lots of people. If
Mm,
your name is Stephen King, you don't have to do those 10 things,
Mm.
but like going on a lot of podcasts
mm,
and speaking a lot about what you've written, or placing an op-ed in the New York Times,
Mm.
or getting on television and
mm,
getting someone. So there are things to be done that can increase probabilities. Danny Kahneman, my friend and co-author, his book Thinking Fast and Slow is really, really famous. It's crazy famous.
Mhm.
People all over know about it. It's still a bestseller. And I was, closely in touch with him while he was writing the book. He almost gave up on it. He thought it was doomed. He
mm.
had no high hopes for it. He thought,
Wow.
what is this about? He at one stage thought, I'm going to pay various people to tell me whether I should publish it. And he was hoping and expecting, he paid them to get an honest opinion because his friends he thought would just tell him it's great. By the
Mm,
way, it's great.
mm,
He paid them and they told him it was really good and he should publish it. And he was kind of disappointed and definitely surprised by that. And people asked him, I asked him how the book became what it became, and various things happened. David Brooks did a column on it. There
Mhm.
mm,
were various stories in prominent places about it. And you can increase the probability of those things for sure. So people who have records out, Olivia Rodrigo is one of my favorites, though she doesn't appear in the book. She clearly did a bunch of things to become Olivia Rodrigo. And if you
Mhm.
haven't heard of her, the two of you or people who are listening, run, don't walk to YouTube and
mm,
play, play All American Bitch. Please do. That's really, really good. And it's also very funny.
mm,
So, but All American Bitch could be, just a thing she did that kind of didn't make it, except for the other things, which increase the probability. So
mm,
if you're 18 years old and you want to be successful in some domain, you got to be really good at something, or I think that's too strong. It helps to be really good at something. And then
mm,
you can do various things that build on your being very good at something. And one of them has a horrible word, probably the worst word in the English language. I hope it isn't censored on your program. It is very vulgar and kind of ugly. Networking.
mm.
But that can help. It's certainly not enough, but it can help if you can get something somewhere where people are watching. Barack Obama, whose campaign I was lucky enough to play a role in first
Mhm.
round, he wanted to win Iowa. He was pretty famous, but he wasn't nearly as famous as Senator Clinton, who was trouncing him in the polls. And he said to people on his campaign, I know I'm way behind, like crazy behind,
Mm.
but I want to be president of Iowa.
Mm,
Help me be president of Iowa, by which he meant, let me win the Iowa primary and then
Mhm.
let's see what happens. And that's kind of trying to create a cascade. The Beatles benefited from that. Bob Dylan had something like the equivalent of being president of Iowa, which was getting a very good New York Times review. He was one of the only folk singers, maybe the only one who got a spectacular review from Robert Shelton. Was he better than any of the others? Maybe. He
mm.
certainly wasn't Bob Dylan yet, but he was president, the equivalent of president of Iowa. So one can try for that.
Wow. Yeah. So, as I'm reading the book, I'm thinking, and this is just, I would say, from the perspective of somebody who is into self-improvement, self-help, stuff like that. The thinking might be, well, this is sort of kind of disheartening. There's a sense that, okay, there's so much out of my control. And isn't the point of, let's say, an entrepreneur, somebody who's just interested in cultivating their talent, isn't the point to think of themselves as somebody who's in some way superhuman? Isn't the point to sort of, so I'm going to use a term that kids tend to use, delulu. So isn't like the point to kind of delude yourself into thinking you're going to make it no matter what? So what would you tell somebody who says, well, Kaz, man, what happened to picking yourself up by your bootstraps? Because this is kind of disheartening. This feels like, it sort of takes a lot of the power away from me.
Hmm.
Okay, that's great. That's great. So I have had one student in the last 10 years who says I asked him, what does he want to be? What does he want to do? And he says he wants to be president.
Hmm.
And he's very confident. He's also superbly talented.
Hmm.
One thing, at least when I was teaching him, that wasn't clear was why he wanted to be president. So he wanted to be president, but what would he do once he became president? What was his purpose as president?
Hmm.
And I thought it would be good for him to figure that out because if you're trying to be, super successful without having a reason for that other than super success,
Hmm.
there's nothing stinky or terrible about him. I admired and liked him, but it wasn't clear, was he interested in economic growth? Was he interested in national security? And and I think that was a challenge. He's not president yet. He's also
Hmm.
not 35 yet. So we'll see. By contrast, Dick Thaler, my collaborator on Nudge and great friend,
Hmm.
um, won the Nobel Prize. He was spectacularly successful. He is spectacularly successful. And when he was in graduate school, he was starting to collect some of the findings that would create behavioral economics.
Hmm.
That people will eat cashews at a party like a lot, but ask the host to take the cashews away.
Hmm.
What?
Hmm. Hmm.
In economic theory, your consumption of something whose existence you deplore, that doesn't make a lot of sense. Or people would pay a lot more, pay a lot less to buy something than they would demand to give up that same thing. So if I gave you how to become famous coffee mugs, chances are you demand more to sell them than you'd be willing to pay for them in the first instance. And
Hmm.
that's consistent with the Coase theorem, which won the Nobel Prize. So he collected all these findings, and his advisor, someone named Sherwin Rosen, who became a very famous economist, said, "What are you doing? This is terrible. This isn't economics. You're ruining your career." And he kind of got that, but he said he continued with it not because he had tremendous self-confidence. I think at some level he had a lot, but that wasn't the thing. It's that he loved doing it. So he said the reason he did behavioral economics wasn't that he was confident he would, even get tenure, but it was just really fun. He loved it. And he
Hmm.
said that's the best hedge if you love something. So
Hmm.
what I think for, if you think about Bob Dylan and listen to him in the early days, he completely loved music,
Hmm.
loved writing his own music. There's an early version I just heard of Hard Rain's Gonna Fall, which he sang before it was released. And you could hear it at a coffee shop, and you could hear his kind of amazement and thrill at the song he wrote. And that feels like he wrote that song, not to become, he also won the Nobel Prize. He just loved doing it. And Stan Lee, before he became anything like a success, his
Hmm.
first comic that he really enjoyed writing was Fantastic Four. And his wife said, write a comic that you are kind of proud of and have fun with. He was about to quit. Nothing was going well in his career. He was
Right.
embarrassed to be a comic book writer. He had no staff. He was just writing like stuff that he thought was drivel. So his wife said, write something you're proud of. So he comes up with the Fantastic Four. And if you look at it at any point, you can see he's having fun with it. There's one thing I'm sure he had a lot of fun with, that the lead male character in Fantastic Four, Reed Richards, had a
Hmm.
superpower. He could elongate himself.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's really funny. Now, the comic book was for kids, and it wasn't, it was an amazing power. He could make his arms really long. But I think he just had fun with it. And the gender politics are partly there and partly Sue Storm, the female lead, her
Hmm.
superpower was she could become invisible. The woman's superpower, she can
Yeah.
make herself invisible.
Mhm.
There's something kind of offensive and self-parodying about his offensiveness in that. I'm not
Hmm.
sure how much about of that he was conscious about, but he tapped into something that was just amazing. And then one of the superhero guys was called the Thing, and he was like really ugly and orange and really strong. And when he had to fight, he'd say it's clobbering time.
Mhm.
And that's a very funny line. And
Hmm.
especially, I think for a failed comic book writer and especially for an 11-year-old kid reader, it's clobbering time. By contrast, Superman would say up, up and away, which is really boring and stylized. So Stan Lee was just having a lot of fun. And I think he himself had no confidence. Also playing in a role in my little book is George Lucas, who
Hmm.
he had such fun with Star Wars. He didn't think it was going to do particularly well. So the unifying theme here, to have confidence, I think at some level is essential. But to love what you're doing, I can say that, all of us, there's some things we like doing, there's some things we kind of have to do, and there's some things we love doing. If
Yeah.
we love doing them, then even if things don't go well, at least we will have had that.
Yeah, and I would even add to that, there's also such great honor in just the attempt to put yourself out there, sort of getting feedback, critical feedback, just honing your craft and just being able to sort of do something that probably take a risk that I think other people wouldn't take. So even if you fail, I mean, I know it's sort of cliche or whatnot, but I would say that there's such pride and there's pride in the honor of being able to do that and to say, here's this thing that I was really passionate about and I devoted my life to it. I mean, whether or not it got critical acclaim was just secondary to it. So.
Completely. I have a friend who's a lawyer who really wants to have a bookstore. She really
Mm.
wants to have a bookstore. And I'm hoping before long she will have a bookstore. You can see her eyes light up when she talks about that. And even if the bookstore doesn't do very well, even if it's not famous, even if it collapses after 3 years, she will have run a bookstore. And
Mhm.
that's what makes her heart soar. So if
Mm.
there's something that makes your heart soar or makes you feel, you've taken a risk, even if it didn't work, you like taking the risk, that's its own form of success.
So.
It's interesting. Before we start, you started getting into speaking about Bob Dylan, Stan Lee, and how they loved what they were doing. You mentioned that student who said they want to become president, and we're not very sure what's his purpose, right? What's his why? I find that interesting that it's very important to have a very strong purpose in order to do these very ambitious things, whether it's to become famous or just do something that is beyond the norm. There's that saying, right? In order to overcome any why, no, you need
Yeah, you need to have a how. Yeah.
no,
Oh
no, no,
no,
no,
like
no,
the other way
no,
around. Other way around. Other way around. Mhm.
yeah, yeah, and I guess how I mean, nah, this is a little bit of a cliche question, but I mean, I suppose yeah, how important is purpose, let's say, in the characters at least talked about in the book, how important is purpose? How central is that theme to them becoming who they were and as famous as they were?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a completely great question. And I'm going over the characters in the book and
Hmm.
others to try to think it through. Okay, William Blake
Hmm.
wrote, better to murder an infant in its cradle than to nurse unacted desires.
Hmm.
Really mean that. It's a proverb of hell, but he meant it a little bit. He said that the reason Milton wrote in fetters when speaking of God and heaven, and at liberty when speaking of Satan and hell, was that he was a true poet and of the devil's party without knowing it. My gosh.
Hmm.
Mm,
Uh, this is William Blake, who was, I think, devout, at least kind of mostly, writing about John Milton, the greatest religious poet in the English language. Now, Blake himself was, uh, in his time, pretty unsuccessful and unknown. And what got him becoming a canonical writer was long after his death, people started getting interested in him. Not a lot, but they created a little bit of a cult. And that made Blake vault
Mm.
where he had otherwise been completely submerged. And
mm,
so those are things external to Blake. Now, Blake, when he was writing, had a purpose, I think. So to your point, he needed that. So writing about Milton, that line, and there's a famous line from Blake, uh, writing about, which I find very helpful for thinking about law and kind of my academic fields. He wrote in the margins. Now, this was not to become famous, though it's a very famous line. He wrote about Sir Joshua Reynolds'
mm,
lectures, where Sir Joshua Reynolds was talking about how artists are generalizers, they have to generalize.
Mm.
And Blake wrote in the margins, uh, to generalize is to be an idiot. Particularize is the alone distinction of true merit.
Mm.
I thank God I am not like Reynolds. Now, those lines are in certain quarters. You can tell in this little head, those are very famous lines. I think they're so relevant to many things where the generalizations are just too coarse,
Mm.
Corse. And he had a purpose. He wanted to nail Reynolds. He thought Reynolds was wrong.
Mm.
And those sentences are written with fire.
mm,
He didn't want to become famous. How did they become famous? Marginalia to lectures by Sir Joshua Reynolds. Other things had to have happen, which is a way of saying purpose is super helpful, but other things have to kind of break your way. This is the serendipity point.
mm,
When I was in the government, my wife and I noticed when I was in government the second round under Obama, my wife and I noticed there were two kinds of people, people who were there to do something and people who were there to be there.
Mm.
So there were people in the White House who were, there was something they cared about. Maybe it was, you know, economic growth. Maybe it was climate change. That was why they were there. And there were others who were there because they wanted to be in the White House. And some of the people who were there because they wanted to be in the White House were amazing at something. Like they
mm,
could manage a process or they could get something done, but they didn't stay very long. And I don't think anyone who's well known in government, this is probably overstated, but anyone who's well known as a government person was there because they wanted to be there rather than
Mm.
because they had a purpose. But
mm,
I'm conscious that particularly now and probably in all times, there are people who just want to be famous. They
Yeah.
don't particularly have a purpose, and they get there. I'm working right now on a new topic. Let's keep it mysterious.
Mm.
And I've discovered someone who was quite a figure maybe 25 years ago in that topic and
Mm.
had quite a radical view and wrote with fire.
Mm.
And, very left radical and had what seemed a principled commitment, and I have every reason to believe it was a principled commitment. I
mm,
recently noticed he's on some other issue, and I've lost track of him. He's on some other issue and has been for a while, where he's on fire. It's the same tense sensibility,
Mm.
and he's quite right of center. And I don't know how to think of this.
Mm.
I don't think he just wants to be famous. I don't think he does. I think he just likes developing a position which he believes to be right and then pushing it with, let's say, high energy.
Interesting.
But there must be other people. I mean, I'll throw a name out and maybe get sued. Tucker Carlson
Mhm.
feels to me like someone who really wants to be famous.
Yeah.
So that they really wants that.
Mm.
Sorry, Mr. Carlson.
Yeah, that's so funny. I mean, the thing is, it's kind of hard to know what's sort of behind people's, I guess, motivations. And but the interesting thing is, like when they make, I guess, certain assessments or they sort of make certain conclusions. I mean, the interesting thing is, I mean, it appeals to a base, and I want to kind of get into this now because I really want to talk about group polarization, which was an important factor in your book. So, I mean, like I don't know exactly like what causes a person to make a switch, but I mean, but we do know with extreme views. I mean, you appeal to a particular base and obviously that base kind of heightens your belief in those views and it makes them even more extreme. So can we actually start with, because I want to get into some of the concepts as we get the podcast rolling. So can we start first with group polarization? What is it and how do people become involved in it?
Okay, so the basic idea is if you get a group of people who tend to think something, after the group members talk with one another, they'll end up more confident, more unified, and more extreme.
Hmm.
So this is a statistical regularity. If you've got a group of people who think climate change is a problem, after they talk with one another, they'll think it's a very, very bad problem. If you get a group of people who think that the 2020 election was stolen, or the 2016 election was stolen, or whichever election was stolen, after they talk to another, they'll think it was certainly and definitely stolen. And what are we going to do about it?
Right.
I have data on this involving punitive damage awards by juries, and it grew out of research where we asked individuals what they thought the damage award should be or how outrageous was the conduct on a bounded numerical scale. And we took the average of individual judgments as probative of where the group would end up. This was a paper we published in for peer review and such. And some critics afterwards said, taking the average is wrong, or it might not be right. How do you know? We were pretty
Mm.
confident that we got it right. One of my co-authors was Danny Kahneman, and he's almost always right. So I thought we had it right. But then we did a study with deliberating juries, and we discovered we were really wrong. If people started out, let's say on a five, on a bounded scale of 0 to 8, that was the average view or the median view,
Hmm.
people would come in at a 6. They'd think it was more outrageous as a group than they did as individuals.
Hmm.
With respect to dollars, in 27% of cases, people came in with a dollar award at least as high as that of the highest individual before they started to talk. So one way to put it is people really charge themselves up. I followed that by doing some work on climate change and same-sex relations and affirmative action, and found if conservatives talk about these issues, groups are much more extreme than the median individual before they talk. And
Wow.
it's also true for left of center groups. So if you get groups of people who are on the left who think that affirmative action is pretty good, on average, after they talk with one another, they on average think affirmative action is terrific.
Hmm.
If you've got a group of people on the right who think affirmative action isn't so good, after they talk with one another, they think affirmative action is horrible. And that
Mm.
means that group interactions can lead people to extremes. And we witness this in culture. I mean, Taylor Swift is great. I think she's fantastic.
Hmm.
There are people who are, let's say, more enthusiastic about her even than is deserved. And that's because they talk to a lot of people who love Taylor Swift. I do too. So I probably love her even more than I should, but take a listen to her performance of Mean at the Grammys and see if you don't agree with me. She's terrific.
So you're pretty much saying if we get a bunch of people who think our podcast is okay and we put them in the room together, then they're all going to think this is the most amazing podcast in the world.
Oh,
That's
on
funny.
average. That's completely right. That's how it works.
Mm.
Now, the
Yeah.
wrinkles are super interesting. So if you get people who agree with Israel and people who think Israel's terrible, and when they talk to each other, probably the pro-Israel people will stay that way and the anti will stay that way. But for culture, with respect to the success of, let's say, Spider-Man, I was part of this as a kid. I was part of a little group polarization machine that was
Mhm.
pro-Spider-Man. If you are pro Spider-Man and your friends are pro Spider-Man, boy, after a couple of weeks, Spider-Man is the most important and best thing in the world.
Wow. So I have to tell you, so as much as I loved your book, and I mean, I told you this when we spoke privately, that your book was one of the best books I've read in the past couple of years. With that being said, what was somewhat disheartening, and the way that I would like to think about it is in this sense, I'm just personally an absolutist about this stuff. So I like to think that talent is more or less, maybe not sacred, but sort of close enough to it, right? So you mentioned the movie yesterday, which you know, kind of just to give a little bit of a synopsis here, it's about this person who ends up finding the Beatles music. Nobody knows who the Beatles are. They end up becoming famous, and so on and so forth. We could get into the details a little bit. But the point is to say, I like that kind of story. So when I see that sort of movie, I'm thinking, okay, but this means that a person has talent. This means that sort of maybe there are things getting in the way of that talent, but fundamentally it's the talent itself that matters. Again, maybe not necessarily sacred, but close enough to anything probably that we're going to get to as sacred in this life. So you kind of chisel away at that. So with something like group polarization as an example, there's also the sense, I'm just going to use the example of the podcast that's because it's kind of comical now. But like, let's say our podcast is not that good, right? Let's say it's just like an average podcast. But if people get together and people start talking about it and a couple of them like it seems like people are going to be like, oh my God, that's such a great podcast, even though it might not necessarily be. So what's interesting to me, at least, is that, or at least actually, no, what it feels to me is that that's so disheartening. And it's a little bit of a disillusionment to think that talent isn't enough, number one. And number two is when we think of talent as being quote unquote discovered, it's just as equally created in our minds. Yeah.
Okay, this is super helpful. So, I agree with you that talent is, as a first approximation, as economists say, necessary
Mhm.
for spectacular success. Let's say that those who are famous, Isabelle Huppert, the French actress, she's incredible. I
Hmm.
would use the F word to describe how incredible she is, but this is a family show. She's really, really great. And she's very famous and super successful. Um, Paul McCartney is extraordinarily talented, and that is clearly closely associated with his fame. To take two different politicians, Barack Obama and Donald Trump are immensely talented politicians. Whatever you think of President Trump, he is a fantastically talented politician. I think that's just clear. Um, Stephen King is such a talented novelist. It's like, I think he's our Charles Dickens. It's oozing from him, the talent,
Hmm.
overflowing with talent. Stephen King. So let's just grant all that. Even if talent is a necessary condition, the Beatles almost didn't make it. They came pretty close to not making it. Jane Austen kind of disappeared, and William Blake completely disappeared.
Mm.
Robert Johnson, now thought by many to be the greatest blues guitarist, or at least the most inspired of all time. So much so that there are a bunch of books written about him that have crossroads in the title, meaning he went to the crossroads and made the deal with the devil. How else? There's no other explanation. No one heard of him. He died in his 20s with approximately 24 recordings, and he died a loser. John Keats wanted to be famous. He was super talented. He wanted to be what he actually became. And he wrote on his gravestone, because he thought he failed, he whose name was written in water, meaning nothing happened.
Yeah.
So there's Connie Converse, who's the hero of the book, the secret hero of the book, who's just becoming famous now, who died probably, she might still be alive. The circumstances of her last years or last months or last days, who knows, are unknown. She's been discovered super recently.
Mm.
So these are examples of super talent maybe not being sufficient, even if it's necessary. So there, maybe we could agree that, and this isn't dispiriting, I think, it's kind of inspiring that if you are really talented, you have the necessary condition for spectacular success. And there are people all around us, like that we pass on the street. This was the only part of the book that I wrote. It's the only one I remember I wrote, and I was almost crying as I wrote it. There are people all on the street that we pass who are incredibly talented.
Mhm.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so to think of them not as, just someone on the street who maybe isn't so well dressed, but someone who is able to do things that hardly anyone else can do. And they're astonishing. And we all discover this sometimes. Yes, someone who seems just regular. I have a friend who's actually really good at her job, but she's also a spectacular guitar player. Who knew?
Mm,
She could have made it as a guitar player. Okay, so it's kind of it makes there's reason for humility about the world, and if one gets to have a podcast or one gets to be a law professor, what so maybe we'll get a little uh uh go a little far afield, but when I was in the government and the Department of Homeland Security, I once went down to the southern border.
mm,
I saw a little line of people trying to come into the United States. It wasn't long or horrible or anything, but there was a line and there were two people from Russia. And I asked the people who actually ran the border, could I talk to them? And they said, no. I said, could I say, wave to them or something or ask them how they were? And they said, you could say that. And so I asked them, and one was probably 35 from Russia, the other maybe young 40s. They both looked robust and strong, and
mhm.
also as if they'd been through hell.
Wow.
And uh, and I thought, the words went through my mind unbidden. There, but for the grace of God, go I.
Mhm,
And they're struggling to get into this country, and who knows? And if they do, who knows? And if they don't, who knows? And then others, have it better. So then the question I think you're asking, see, if you suppose you don't have talent, can you make spectacular success? And it's kind of in your implicit in your question, not. But I don't know. Are the Kardashians spectacularly talented?
mhm.
They're good at some things.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe I
Yeah.
just don't know enough.
Yeah.
But
But
they're
also,
famous enough so I know their names.
I mean, so the way I understand your answer is what you're saying is even if something isn't necessarily initially sort of well received or as well received as one would hope, one still needs to have the talent for there's something to sort of to be fostered or to percolate. Meaning that maybe Taylor Swift is an example, just as an example. So maybe Taylor Swift isn't exactly well received initially or sort of heard, but it's sort of like, with music, a lot of times you need to be in the proper space. And sometimes, yeah, you do need to have some sort of influence. You mentioned network effects, which I actually want to get into next. Well, no, I'm sorry, actually, not network effects, reputational effects. Let's do that one. So reputational effect, just because it's connected to what I'm talking about. What?
Could I ask one
Yeah, yeah,
quick
no,
thing?
no, go ahead.
Yeah. In regards to modern fame, it's very fragile, I would think. Maybe you both would agree, in the sense that I guess now how you become famous. I mean, of course, there are people like Brad Pitt who are still famous. Robert De Niro. Like older fame, let's
Mhm,
say. And then there's if you think of other actors, they're somewhat consistent in the zeitgeist. But in regards to like people who become famous, like these influencers, TikTokers, let's say even podcasters and so forth. Um, do you think that modern fame is more fragile because the way that the information kind of cascades, let's say let's say via the algorithm or in someone's echo chamber or whatever, it's so I wouldn't call it arbitrary. It's not that. It just seems that what you can be fed or given can change, let's say moment to moment. And so in order for someone to have that consistent level of fame or renown, it's harder. And then is it even worth really pursuing fame anymore? Should we just stick to purpose? And like what do we want to do instead of like even pursuing fame at all,
mhm.
you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Um, I think to pursue fame isn't the most obvious thing. So, unless I guess you're a singer or a movie maker, an actor, to pursue, doing something that's good, is a more obvious thing to pursue. So, if you are doing something in entertainment or education, I listen to conservative talk radio. Um, tend to be moderate or left of center. I listen to conservative talk radio. And some of them, Sean Hannity is actually on the radio quite good. He's good at what he does. He's quick. He's funny. He's interactive with people. He's very good at it. I think for him to pursue being good at it is a recipe for, something other than self-loathing. And
Right.
also it's helpful for success. There's another guy I listen to and I particularly enjoy listening to because he was on the attack against me for a long time. Glenn Beck. He
Mm,
he has some skills, but he's not as good as Sean Hannity.
mm,
Now, what's he interested in? I don't know, but I think if you think I want to be famous, it's a little self-defeating. Now, on
Mm.
the evanescence point, comparing now with the 1930s or the 1820s or the 1700s or the 1200s, of course, you could be geographically much more famous. The spread can be a lot wider, so you can be worldwide famous. I'm amazed to see, I've talked about this book with people in other countries, and I'm always a little nervous talking about Bob Dylan or Taylor Swift and even Olivia Rodrigo, and people always know who I'm talking about.
mm,
So doesn't matter, they're worldwide fame. So there's that. I'm sure you're right that you can have evanescent fame, and the question is what you want from that. So from Instagram or TikTok, you have 2 weeks of being super famous. Is that like, I don't know why that would be thrilling.
Right.
It would be noteworthy, but you know, um, uh, I met someone at one point
Mhm.
whom it would be interesting for people to know I met this person,
mm,
but it's not actually objective. I don't have anything interesting to say about the meeting of the person. And if I put it out, I'm sure it would get attention. It's just, I'm being mysterious here,
mm,
but I'm not going to say.
mhm,
But to have that interaction famous or to get well known in circles in which I'm not because of that. I mean, why would that be good?
mm,
But I have a book right here. I have a book like right about 2 feet away that I just got in the mail. It's called Uncertainty in Economics.
mm,
It was a very expensive book from Springer, and it just arrived today, and it's about 130 pages and very expensive. So it's not going to be a famous book, but the guy who wrote it, uh, he did something great. I've looked into it. It's like a really good book.
Mm.
Uh, I'm learning a lot from it. I've started reading it uh, uh, with what's the right word? Idiosyncratic excitement. I
mm,
think not most people would be so excited to start a book on uncertainty in economics, but I am. He's done something really good. And, how much fame is he going to get out of it? I'm pretty sure none, except if people grab onto it because of this podcast or something similar. And that would be nice for him and for his book. But he did something good.
mhm,
And I'm thinking that there is a singer, I know one young singer, I happen to know her parents, and
Mhm.
I was amazed to see that the one I knew as a girl is really famous. I'll say it is Gracie Abrams.
mm,
And
Okay.
I don't know her parents well, but I know them, and I met her when she was little and she was interested in music.
mhm,
And I think she's fantastic. And I thought she was fantastic before I put the connection with her parents and someone I knew when she was little. And she, as you say, was purpose. I don't know her well, but when she was little, she really loved music and she loved writing music. A little like Dick Thaler loved doing economics and Stan Lee doing the Fantastic Four. And I think you're right that you can get, I hope Gracie Abrams will have long-term fame, but if you get short-term fame even, or 2 weeks or 3 weeks because you did, you know, I Love You, I'm Sorry, which is a great song, or because you did Uncertainty in Economics, then what's great about it is the thing you did, not what resulted from it.
Oh, I love that. So, Alan, I'm actually super happy that you asked that question because I'm going to now tie this back into reputational cascades. So, Cass, would you say that, and you can kind of stop me if this is a little bit of a crude explanation, but I feel like this is sort of where both of you are going. Would you say that essentially, when it comes to reputations, that what ends up happening is that you have somebody who, let's say, is talented, right? And then you have reputations that sort of springboard that person, and maybe initially it comes from a place of, well, I kind of just want to fit in. Let's say if you could even tie in network effects here too, where there's a sense of I want to know about this, right? But then you also have the reputation of okay, or the sense of I want to fit in, so therefore I'm going to try to sort of like this person. Maybe I even do like them, or I'll pretend to like them. But fundamentally, I think my thinking here is there's a distinction being made here about fame and the different types of fame. I feel like what you and Alan are talking about, this sort of baseline fame, which is like it's sort of more simplistic and it's more sort of shallow, right? But then when you have something that's actual talent, when you have again using these examples, Bob Dylan, like a Taylor Swift, the idea is that their fame is sort of more long-standing, number one, and it's also, I would say, probably more influential or more impactful in the sense of like, let's say with the Kardashians, you just watch it for entertainment, whereas somebody like a Bob Dylan, or for me, Tupac, who is one of my favorites, these people touch your soul. So the idea is that even if you have a reputation that, let's say, fosters fame, and then you have some people on the outskirts of that, or even a good amount of people in that sort of bubble, in that cascade, and let's say maybe they just want to be a part of the group, maybe they themselves want to sort of fit in, or they want to be popular, or whatever. But the idea is it kind of doesn't matter because you have enough people who are sort of who are the foundation of that person's reputation, because that they're actually talented and that they're influential and they touch people. Whereas opposed to something like, let's say, and of course, to be clear, this is not that black and white because the Kardashians do have lasting fame, so that might be the exception here. But I think fundamentally what you're saying is the lasting fame usually, if not always, usually comes and springboards from talent, even though on some degree you have a reputation that, let's say, more or less based on shallowness.
I think you're fundamentally right, and you have a good kind of ancestor here, who's Samuel Johnson.
Mm-hmm.
Wrote about this and thought that lasting fame has to be great. And he wrote a long time ago, Shakespeare was his exhibit. He thought Shakespeare's lasted a long time and he was incredible, and that's why he lasted. So let's think a little bit about that. So you can have spikes of anonymity and fame, even though you're amazing. And that's true of Robert Johnson, the guitarist, etc. And it's also true of Jane Austen. So, so there's that. You can have short-term fame. I really like the Dave Clark Five, but I think it's probably fair to say they weren't that great, and their short-term fame was suited. I don't believe this in my heart, but I kind of believe it in my head. Suited
Mm.
their level of very good, but not Beatles level, etc. That's fair. Then can there be, you're asking, long-term fame without amazingness and talent? I think you're right that that would be surprising. You might be famous for a long time for having been famous, but why would one read? There's Keynes, who's a very famous economist. I just got a book called The Essential Keynes. What if there was someone named Taines who was, super famous for a while as an economist, but not in the end very good? There wouldn't be a reprint many decades after his death
Mm.
called The Essential Taines. So I think that's fundamentally right, that long term, it would be surprising if long term fame for something other than being famous was accompanied by a failure to be talented. And I'm flashing as you talk to an exchange I had in China, and I'm thinking how this fits in. When I was in China a few decades ago, my host showed me around the Beijing Museum of the History of China. We came across the exhibit for Genghis Khan. And I kind of recoiled, physically recoiled, and I said, "Oh, a terrible tyrant." And my host responded kind of sternly and said, "No, a great leader." And
Interesting.
and I felt American host has really put a foot in his mouth. So the only thing I could say was, "Oh, I don't know what I'm talking about, American propaganda." And he responded quick as a flash, "Chinese propaganda." Now, Genghis Khan, the reason I flashed to it is Genghis Khan is very famous in the United States, also in China, famous for different things. Would we say he was talented?
Mm,
I guess he was amazing at what he did, which was kind of
sure.
to good at it. So this, in the end, probably does fit with what you say. I'm thinking, I'm thinking, what are the domains in Fred Astaire and Gene Kelly, pretty famous dancers for a long time. They're really, really good. Sid Charisse, I think, amazingly good.
Mm,
Now, if these are unfamiliar names, they're kind of famous in some circles, and it fits with what you say. They're really talented. So let's say the thesis that long-term success, long-term fame can't exist without talent is fundamentally right, unless you're famous for having been famous
mm.
than having been talented or great.
Wow. Okay, and then let's move on to the next one. So the next one is informational cascade. What is that?
Okay, so let's suppose you have a group of people who are deciding what movie to go to. And the first says, let's go to this new movie, Star Wars.
Mm,
And the second says, I don't really know. I'm kind of 50-50, but I'll go with the first. And then the third thinks, I kind of don't want to go see Star Wars. It sounds dumb. But if the first two people in the group say Star Wars, they probably know things that I don't know. So I say Star Wars too.
Hmm.
The fourth person, call him David in our little queue, fourth letter of the alphabet, would have to have a lot of information to reject the shared informational signal given by the first three. So an informational cascade occurs when people end up ignoring or finding their own informational signal outweighed by the signals given by their predecessors, and then vote for, Barack Obama or Donald Trump, not because they particularly like them, but because other people seem to like them. That's why Obama wanted to be president of Iowa. And that's why I learned, maybe in connection with this book or maybe an earlier one, that there's a magic word in book publishing. It's called pre-orders.
hmm
They want lots of pre-orders. I hadn't heard that word till relatively recently. And the reason they want pre-orders is they want to create an informational cascade. If a book has a lot of pre-orders, then people see lots of other people are buying it.
Mm,
Mm, okay.
They are informed by that signal that this is a book they ought to get. Uh, John F. Kennedy, President Kennedy's dad, bought, I think, 40,000 copies of Profiles in Courage
mm,
to create an informational cascade that this is a book you ought to buy.
mm,
And it worked. It's a pretty good book. It won the Pulitzer, I think, and it's become a classic. Was that fueled by the cascade introduced by the 40,000 sales? I've seen with books that people, publishers that is, really want something to be on the New York Times bestseller list.
mhm,
If it happens one week, then there's a cascade. And informational cascades, if Oprah Winfrey, when she was doing books, if she put called Oprah's Book Club, something was on it, then it's basically made for its life. We have the data because that's a very strong
True.
information signal.
mhm.
So informational cascades don't have to do with reputation, but they produce fame. Jane Austen benefited long after her life from an informational cascade that's still echoing in our culture.
Right. So this is the Matthew effect.
Yeah, it's the Matthew effect.
Yeah. And can you get into a little bit about what that is?
Yeah, the Matthew effect is the rich get richer. So it was originally discovered in a paper that found like Nobel Prize winners' papers get cited a lot. and they get cited a lot when they have co-authors for reasons that seem independent of how good they are. Once you get the Nobel Prize, then your papers are just going to get attended to. And I found this when I was in high school. This is a little autobiographical, but I noticed it that I got a reputation that I wrote good papers, and then I would write not that good papers, but I get a good grade
Mm,
because I think the teachers thought he writes good papers, and I have some information from previous grades he has. I wouldn't always get a great grade, but I get an A- when I probably deserved a B plus
mm.
because the informational cascade.
Wow.
And this happens for, people who do well, and it also can happen. It's extremely regrettable. People have an informational cascade, that they're not good in school or that their uh, records don't sell. Um, there was a movie called Searching for Sugar Man about
Hmm.
Cecil Rodriguez, who became a smash hit in South Africa. The
Hmm.
movie was about how he was a legend in South Africa. There's an informational cascade for Rodriguez in South Africa that was very favorable, and people thought, how did he die? Why did he stop? He was as good as the Rolling Stones, and then he disappeared after two albums. And that was, he was a phenomenon in South Africa because of the cascade effect. But there was a kind of down cascade in the United States where people didn't buy his records. People thought Rodriguez is a failure, and ultimately he became a demolition worker.
Wow, man. And you know what's so interesting is that a couple of weeks ago, so I first want to shout him out before I mention him. Shout out to our guy Mark White. So Mark White actually helped facilitate this conversation with Kaz. So we had Mark on our podcast a couple of weeks ago, and I said this to him, so I'm sure he wouldn't mind me repeating this. I said to him, so Mark White is legitimately one of my favorite writers, thinkers. If anybody goes onto my Psychology Today page, they'll find that at least some of my work is based on his ideas. I got a lot of out of our conversations personally, professionally here on the podcast together. And so I remember telling him on the show, I said, it's so interesting to me that whereas, and this is not me saying that Mark is not okay with wherever he is professionally. This is just my opinion. So I was saying that, it's kind of interesting that somebody like a Jordan Peterson, who I just personally don't respect very much intellectually, I like some of his ideas, but I'm just not a huge fan, even as a therapist. But somebody like a Jordan Peterson is a, number one bestseller. He sells God knows how many books, but Mark is obviously more obscure. I'm not saying Mark is obscure. I'm saying he's more obscure than Jordan Peterson. So something like that kind of does make me feel hopeless because in my mind, I'm thinking, okay, here's this person, this brilliant philosopher who produces such quality work. He's nowhere near on the level of a Jordan Peterson. And so to me, I think about it and think, my God, like, how is it that people can't see that? So what do you think has, I mean, and I'm not saying you have to agree with me, by the way, none of this. I'm just saying in these kind of situations where you see that, let's say maybe one person has work that's of much more of desire, much more higher quality, and to me at least much more desirable than somebody else and some contemporary. How do we kind of make sense of that? Because one would think that quality should outlast at the end of the day, that quality should win out, and a lot of times it doesn't.
You're completely right. And this is it, it complicates your point about talent.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of a law professor I know in California who I think is phenomenal. She's really, really good. And she's not at a particularly well-known law school, and her work isn't particularly well known. And I think it's as good as papers by extremely well-known professors at the best universities. It's off the charts good. And I share your high view of Mark White. I think he's phenomenal. Now, what happened to this person? The person I'm thinking of, she was almost hired by a top law school,
Mm.
almost, and didn't quite get that offer. She should have got the offer. Things could have gone. She's a little like the Beatles without Brian Epstein or something, or without George Martin or a bunch of other things. So there's that. I think that's all around us, people who are amazing and just aren't sufficiently recognized. Now, we might think, uh, I'm hopeful that Mark White knows he does amazing work. He has people like you who admire his work. There are a lot of people who admire his work. If he's not a household name, that's okay. The work will last. And the law professor I'm thinking of, the same can be said. So
Mhm.
it's a little like I'm looking over this book, Uncertainty in Economics. I think it's a fantastic success, even if, 120 people read it. And I'm
Mm,
hoping it will, you know, have a proliferating impact because it adds to knowledge. Then there's Jordan Peterson, and uh, I don't know his work super well, but I think he's not how to put this. He's not, if you were sending someone to an advanced civilization to show what humanity was capable of, he wouldn't be the first one you'd send.
right.
Now, why is he so famous? It's a great question. He's vivid and um, uh, uh, clear. And clearly, his vividness and clarity resonates with a lot of people. And he seems to have anger that he channels toward something that makes the world orderly. And if you have anger that you, this is, if you have anger that you can, here's a hypothesis.
Hmm.
If you have anger that you can channel to make the world orderly, you have a good chance of getting an audience. Ayn Rand did that.
Yep.
She was full of anger, and he does that. Now there are specific things he says, and I don't know well enough what he says, but things about men that men like to hear
Hmm.
makes them feel some way.
Yeah, and I would also ask you, since you mentioned Ayn Rand, to actually please tell us a little bit about her because she's actually very Peterson-esque. So she's great at telling narratives. She's not necessarily great at expounding ideas. So I think the idea with somebody like an Ayn Rand is, and you mentioned this obviously in your book. But she is a great storyteller, and she sort of feeds into something that we collectively feel as though we need to hear.
Completely. So, The Fountainhead I read as a teenager because I had a friend whom I'm visualizing right now who just went crazy for Ayn Rand and The Fountainhead. And The Fountainhead I read pretty recently. It holds up. She's a great storyteller. Um, she's a very vivid novelist. Now, is meant by that? She can heighten drama. She can do erotic, the characters, it's there's some energy there.
Mhm.
Um, she can tap into things in the human psyche in a way that, props to her.
Hmm.
I think something similar can be said of Atlas Shrugged, but that's much more didactic
Hmm.
and long kind of essay-like uh, passages, I think, defeat the narrative and the storytelling at times in Atlas Shrugged. But I'm probably wrong because Atlas Shrugged is a spectacular bestseller.
Hmm.
Yeah, so it has a good narrative. Who is John Galt? She makes that really interesting. It tells mysteries. She's good with villains and good with heroes. With ideas, I think in the end, there's not a lot there in Ayn Rand, but she did have a connection with some part of the human psyche, which is selfishness is good in a way that isn't like really cheap, in a way more that is, live your life.
Mhm.
I heard on conservative talk radio not long ago an ad for another podcast or something with someone who was an actress a long time ago, not that long ago, who had some line. I'm going to mangle it, but it's something like, "What about me? I matter." And
Hmm.
she said something like that in her TV show. It was not that line exactly, but it had that feel. And now
Mhm.
she's a podcast that's roughly, "What about me? I matter." And that's gentler than Ayn Rand, but Rand's uh, the virtue of selfishness and, do what you want for you. Clearly, there's something good in that. It's not only, mean or harsh, but there's
Mhm.
something that's people need to hear. They matter, and there's something about her message. that connects with people who are, I don't know, adolescent or uh, hate themselves. She can get at that.
Right. So what you're ultimately saying, I think, is that it seems like that talent comes in many forms, even though, I mean, I guess unfortunately for Ayn Rand, sometimes we just aren't able to see them. Okay, and I think that's such a I think that
That's hilarious.
I think that that's such a great endpoint. Alan, final questions for Cass before I'm sorry. Final questions for Cass before we wrap up.
Absolutely. Yes, if we wanted to follow you, follow your work, and of course buy the book, where can we do that?
Okay, so the book How to Become Famous, which of my various scribblings, as noted, it was at least the one I had most fun doing, can be gotten on. They have this new website with a bookseller, Amazon, I think it's called. They have
Yeah.
books available, and Barnes and Noble, lots of online sites have How to Become Famous available. It's easy to get. And you can get it in a lot of bookstores too. If the bookstores don't have it, they kind of have some explaining to do, because why would a bookstore not have a book called How to Become Famous?
True.
Uh, you, like there is a book someone told me, a feminist book called How to Suppress Women's Writing, that
Mm.
was in the how-to section of the bookstore.
Oh man.
It probably didn't belong there, but How to Become Famous, if it's in the how-to section of the bookstore, that's completely fine by me. To follow me, everyone's on the Social Science Research Network, of course. That's the universally beloved. It's destroying TikTok and Instagram. Okay, it's obscure. Social
Mm.
Science Research Network. My papers are on Social Science Research Network.
Yeah.
And I'm on the artist formerly known as Twitter. Now they call it X.
I love it. Cass, thank you so much. I can't even tell you what an honor this is.
Yeah.
And I want you to know from both of us, we have a tremendous amount of respect for both you and your wife, Samantha.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for that. An honor to get to talk to you.
You
Absolutely,
as well.
Cass. All right. I hope you have a good night, man. I'll talk to you soon.
Take care.
Thanks. Thanks.
Bye.
All right. That was great. So, everyone, as you know, if you'd like to follow us, you can follow us at Seize the Moment Podcast on Facebook and on Instagram. On X, where it's Seize underscore podcast. Like, subscribe,
Hit
hit
the
the bell
bell
on
on
YouTube.
YouTube.
And again, thank you so much for watching and see you next time.